Welcome back. Welcome back to yet another English session. But you know, if I remember well, hydrogen is more than 95% of the mass of the universe, so it's a universal project, a universal subject. And we are going to tackle the subject with a certain level of understanding with my
You're putting pressure on me right now.
No. First of all, welcome. I would like you to introduce yourself because you have multiple hats, right? And today we want to talk about the geopolitics of hydrogen because it is a worldwide subject.
It's a worldwide subject, and it's a geopolitical subject. It's something that's often overlooked, and it should not be, or it cannot be anymore. So my name is Medev. I'm an adjunct lecturer at HEC Paris and in other schools as well on hydrogen geopolitics and hydrogen markets. And so what I try to do is basically to convey these topics of hydrogen from another perspective, the geopolitical one, because definitely what's happening right now in the world is that hydrogen is not just a business issue. It is a highly political issue, and if we don't tackle it from a geopolitical aspect, well, we're missing a big part of the equation, and I'm sure we're going to spend the next 20 minutes detailing that.
Well, precisely. This is what we are going to do. I think you have another hat as well, relating to Medev International?
I do, definitely. So actually, I have several hats. I don't want to brag too much. But yes, I'm a member of the steering committee of the Hydrogen Task Force, which is a private initiative here in France, a joint initiative from Medev International and from France Hydrogène as well. It's basically the largest private community dedicated to hydrogen affairs in general in France. And basically, this is the body which is going to help a lot of French companies, big or small, go international, basically, go abroad. And whether we're talking about upstream, midstream, or downstream markets, definitely we are talking about international markets with a lot of geopolitical implications and challenges, definitely.
I'm just still a bit curious. Where are you coming from? I mean, when did you jump on that subject? And why are you interested in hydrogen? Where it's coming from?
Well, actually, I've boarded the hydrogen train quite a while ago. Actually, my father used to own a startup company on fuel cells, basically 20 years ago. So, well, it closed, and now he's no longer in the business, but definitely it started quite an early age for me. And actually, by trade, I'm an expert on Arctic and Antarctic affairs, so on North Pole and South Pole issues at first sight. And basically, I've come to hydrogen like 8-9 years ago, in 2018, 2012, 2013, when a lot of Arctic countries in particular, name Russia, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and many others, started thinking about hydrogen as a long-term solution, not just for themselves to decarbonize their own industries or whatever, but to basically, from the Arctic's renewable energy potential, decarbonize or help decarbonize the world altogether. So it started quite early in the Arctic. 10 years ago, it was definitely under the rug. Nobody really saw that. It was under the radar of many people. But actually, for those who were in the Arctic at the time, it was already quite strong. There was something concrete. And now we are seeing all of the 8 Arctic states involved directly in these international grand schemes around hydrogen.
Okay. Now, let's tackle the subject itself. Just to remind, hydrogen is already a worldwide market. It's more than $120 billion of business, mainly as a feedstock in an industrial process, of course. But I remember something that Mr. Potier, the CEO of Air Liquide, said 10 years ago, or it was back in 2010. He was saying basically that if just 1% of the total fleet of vehicles in the world was converted to hydrogen, he would multiply his turnover by 10, which gives us a very little insight into what is at stake behind that. So today, we are entering in a new era where we are basically creating new markets with hydrogen and especially with green hydrogen. So now it's time to understand how the areas of the world are trying to enter that game and play their own position, and what are the political impacts behind that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, sure. What is very interesting is that I would say there are three types of countries who've gone early into the hydrogen business. The first type of countries, it's basically mining countries. Countries who were already exploiting either coal or some minerals, who very early, I'm thinking about South Africa, I'm thinking about Australia, who were very interested from an early stage in not only decarbonizing their mining sector, but basically using their knowledge, their know-how, their business structure, everything that they had already in place for the mining sector or for the oil and gas sector, and apply it to hydrogen and actually try to see if there could be a market in the future. So this was the first type of countries. Then you had a second type of countries, which are countries where you have a lot of oil and gas resources, which are transformed on site in the country, not just exported as crude oil, for example. And here, of course, you will have Russia, you will have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and many others like that, who started to get into hydrogen quite at an early stage as well, basically because they saw that on a long-term perspective, say by the 2030s or 2050s, it would be inevitable for them that at some point they would have to decarbonize this sector to de-risk their oil and gas business. So that's the second type of countries. And then the third type of countries are basically countries with a lot of renewables that they wanted to leverage for green electricity production, and which are now saying, well, say Iceland, Costa Rica, Uruguay, or Norway, we have a lot of potential, we have a lot of surpluses, and we don't know what to do with these surpluses. So in the case of Norway or Iceland, there were plans to basically build subsea cables, electric cables, to export this electricity down south to Europe. So that can be done. The Icelanders did not do it, but the Norwegians did it. But on top of that, when you're in Uruguay or when you're in Paraguay, you have these surpluses, you want to export this wasted energy today. You don't know what to do. You can't build a subsea cable from Uruguay, say, to Africa. It's just too, of course, too costly, too long. So basically, they were the first ones as well to consider developing a international hydrogen supply chain. So not all of them were either good enough or equipped enough from an academic perspective or from an engineering perspective or other types of perspectives to build in the 2000s or in the early 2010s a local hydrogen supply chain and industry. But now a lot of things have changed. And of course, there's a global market to tap. And that's the reason why these countries may be seen as newcomers in the geopolitics of energy altogether, but actually they started to position themselves quite early. Think about Malaysia, for example. That's a very interesting country where you will find the three aspects I've just described. Malaysia was one of the very first countries in the world to actually build a hydrogen roadmap as early as in 2006. That's 15 years ago. So they're not coming out of nowhere. And what's interesting is that when you look at it from a geopolitical point of view, then you start seeing how these local industries and stakeholders have actually built what was necessary to now have a real impact in the emerging momentum of hydrogen.
Yeah, we need to remember that when we started to talk about hydrogen, notably in France, one of the main arguments was to say that it's a way to bring back energy independency back to the country, so we can produce locally. But as soon as we really start to consider the global figures, the amount of hydrogen that we need, we start to see that we certainly would need to import hydrogen, right? and that's an opportunity for the countries that can produce at a very low cost to be able to transport that hydrogen and distribute it at a very competitive price.
Well, you know all too well that you're putting your finger on the very big deal right now, because actually this has been a huge debate here in France, but in many countries. And it's very interesting now when we compare the national hydrogen strategies from countries like France, the Netherlands, Germany, or think about South Korea or Japan, how all these countries have a different vision of these imported hydrogen supply chain. It's very interesting to see how, for example, in Korea, you had for the first two iterations of this strategy in 2018 and in 2020, the idea that it would be in the future, say in 2030 or 2035, it would be cheaper to import green hydrogen coming from Australia or blue hydrogen coming from Australia, in the case of Korea, than trying to producing it domestically. In 2018 and 2020, the Koreans used to say that, well, it's going to be tough to produce our own hydrogen because we don't have enough land mass. We need really rely on these imports. And now, in late 2020, after the coronavirus and the recovery plans and so on and so forth, in late 2020 and 2021, it was interesting to see how the Korean hydrogen community started saying, well, we're going to import some of this hydrogen, but we can start leveraging our maritime area as well, our maritime domain, to actually produce domestically some seaborne hydrogen, if you allow me the expression. It was interesting to see that in Japan it was the same thing with the first strategies, hydrogen strategies in 2013, 14, 16, 17, not talking about leveraging the maritime domain to produce hydrogen, and now they're saying the same thing. We're also going to produce part of our hydrogen with floating platforms, with wind, with floating solar possibly, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to see how things have moved towards that. Whereas in France or in Germany, well, there's been there's been a debate on this on a very early stage. You were there in the very stages yourself, and definitely this question of whether we should produce domestically with local hubs or whether we should import most of our hydrogen is definitely what's now blocking, to some extent, having a integrated European hydrogen strategy, fully integrated. Because yes, there's a document. It's been produced and published last July, in July 2020, sorry. But what's interesting is to see that despite this document, well, the French and the group of countries that are following the French view versus the German one is totally different. And it's very interesting to see that now even President Macron is nowhere near, or I don't want to say nowhere near, that's a wrong formulation. He is not ready yet to make this arbitrage. Should we do one or the other? And that's going to be a problem, because if you want to have a French-German integrated vision of hydrogen, to have a European critical mass, to actually have a huge weight on the global market, then Paris and Berlin have to align. So is it going to be on 50% of 50% imports, 30% imports? Is it going to be imports of blue and green hydrogen, only green? These are the questions that are left unanswered at this point.
Yeah, or can we do both? And if we can do both, how do we protect our first movers? Because there will be a problem of competitivity at some point. So I think the main challenge for the French government or the other countries in Europe is basically, first of all, to make sure that all the investment that we are putting on the table right now to start up, to kick off this new economy, have to be protected at some point. And how do you, when do you switch? When do you connect? What is the roadmap? And every country has a different perception on that.
Definitely, and there's two elements to this debate, I would say, from once again, geoeconomical point of view rather than geopolitical. The first element is, how do you protect your first movers in the sense of hydrogen producers? French green hydrogen producers will have to go at some point to Chile, Australia, Uruguay, Brazil, Norway, Iceland, or so on. And what's very interesting is that right now there needs to be, and it has to be, it's become quite urgent, I would say. There has to be some kind of a some kind of scheme to basically help those French first movers go abroad and make sure that when they develop their projects there, they will be able to import, to find basically some clients back in France without killing the industry in France itself. This is definitely a huge task, but only the government and the local governments, the regional governments, can do it at this point. And then there's a second element. How do you protect French first movers who are in the midstream sector, those who are producing the electrolyzers, for example, those who are producing the compressors, and so on. And these guys, well, you have to help them produce here and then sell their products abroad, like the Germans are doing, like the Dutch are doing, like the Brits are doing, like the Americans are doing, like the Koreans are doing. And at this point, it's very interesting to see how in France, and once again, this is not a point of view from Medev International. I'm speaking in my own view here. This is my own words. It's very interesting to see how small companies and medium-sized companies in France at this point are not getting enough support compared to the large groups. The large groups, they're identified. Bercy helps them. The Ministry of Economy and Industry, they're being helped, and so on and so forth. They have access to the IPCEIs at the European level. But if you take some actors like HDF Energy or others of that size, they're not really helped that much. And there's a risk that these companies go actually abroad to produce their electrolyzers, their fuel cells, their compressors, or whatever. And Spain, Portugal, Italy, Great Britain, and Germany, of course, they're all getting ready, gearing up to welcome them if the French government doesn't help them to what they need.
As an entrepreneur for about more than 35 years, you don't need to preach me on that because I do understand what that means for a small enterprise or a medium enterprise with the French culture, more specifically. How difficult it is. So
that's a problem my father had 20 years ago with his own startup, so it's nothing new.
I'm pretty sure about that. So there are two ways to tackle that. The first one is to create a domestic market that is more accessible to the small companies, and the second one is, of course, to bring the services and the support and the task force and the teamwork in order to go after export markets, right? And clearly, then we are getting in direct competition with all our friends with whom we want to build a global market, right? So that is becoming very complex to make good decisions on that.
And I'm afraid this is the very reason why Medev International has started together with France Hydrogène this task force, actually. Because there needs to be a voice, or at least a forum, a place where you can discuss that freely without some institutional issues that could get in the way. So definitely from a geopolitical point of view, once again, the countries who are going to win in the hydrogen battle in the future are the countries who are able to actually build a, how can I put this, a honest and a free stakeholders management system domestically in order to gear up, like as a team, as a national team, to go abroad and win markets.
How can you help on that?
How can
because
I
clearly
help on that?
It's clearly an issue. It's not working very well.
It's not, but actually in France, what's interesting is that hydrogen is both an old topic and a very new one. And it's very interesting to see how this new dynamic that we've been seeing for the past 3-4 years, well, first, it wouldn't have been possible without the pioneers who started this 40, 30, 20 years ago. That's the first thing. And here there are some research groups, some research agencies. I'm thinking about the CEA here, for example. There are also some big groups, some small companies, investors. Without them, it wouldn't have been possible for France to just have the discussion we're having now with these new stakeholder management forums and systems to discuss how we can go abroad and project ourselves. So first of all, kudos to them. Second point, and I'll end with that because I know we're reaching the end of our session. Definitely at this point, we now have one thing that a lot of countries envy us, and that is the fact that in France, we have some very well integrated hydrogen sector. There are some small companies, medium-sized companies, big companies, some research groups, some laboratories, some universities, some academic possibilities to basically master all the different bricks of this new industry, both from a horizontal perspective, from a sector coupling perspective, but also from a vertical perspective as well. We're good, and we have very interesting companies that are very good at both producing hydrogen, transporting hydrogen, compressing hydrogen, storing hydrogen naturally or artificially, delivering hydrogen to the end clients, and also some services companies. It's all there. So the ecosystem is there. And now it's being organized thanks to a lot of different partners who are now basically starting to harmonize, align their views and their ways of doing work and building this kind of French team to project themselves abroad and as well turn hydrogen into something concrete domestically.
Yeah, I do agree that we have a fully integrated landscape with lots of players, and we need to remember that in France only more than 123 labs were working on a hydrogen subject, but with no domestic markets and no industrial players to work with. So I believe that the problem is more a cultural problem at some points in the decision making to move forward.
Yeah, but we've seen that in Spain, we've been observing that in Portugal, we've seen that in Germany, in the Netherlands. A lot of countries have believed in the past 10 years that they would have more to lose by trying to structure their hydrogen ecosystem than getting something. And actually, other countries outside of Europe with a more risk-taking or more opportunistic approach to innovation have shown us the way. And here I'm thinking about Australia, I'm thinking about New Zealand, about some South American countries like Chile once again. You can think even of countries that you would not necessarily believe to be first movers in the energy transition, like the US. In the US right now, in Texas, in California, or even in Alaska, which is definitely outside the radar of many people. That's why people should come to the Arctic. Sure. There are some very interesting ecosystem management, ecosystem building, stakeholders structuring approaches, which are now showing to us back in Europe that it's worth investing in hydrogen, and it's worth investing a lot of public money. The idea that the acceleration, or even better, the multiplier effect actually works. So now those who were risk averse vis-a-vis hydrogen, or thinking that natural gas was the thing, it was the energy who would enable the transition, they're now moving to hydrogen, and rightfully so. Whether this hydrogen is blue or green or pink, I mean, I don't want to speak too much of colors because there are a lot of Daltonian peoples right now in hydrogen. But definitely, whether you're talking about all these kinds of hydrogen, or you're talking about just hydrogen in itself as an industry, France and Europe now is definitely risk-taking rather than risk-averse, and that's a good thing.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to wrap up. It's a very interesting subject. Maybe the conclusion is we often said that we need to scale up. But we also need to scale up in terms of mindset and organization with the entire, with all the stakeholders. So thank you very much for your insight. It's very interesting. Basically, the next step for you before we go, say,
the next step for me is basically to keep being optimistic. The thing that's going to work is to share positive messages. That's all. If you are positive regarding hydrogen, you will gather people around. If you keep on saying, well, hydrogen can be, but this but kills everything. So here, there's a lot of youth in France that's very vibrant and sharing this very optimistic message all across the country in engineering schools, in business schools, at Sciences Po. So definitely build on the youth.
I like that, and I still feel young. Thank you very much. It's time for everyone to get to lunch. Thanks a lot.